Yeah, I think we're live now.
Live. Awesome. Welcome, Amit. Welcome, Dilip. We are live.
Hey
Hi,
Rajan, hey Dalit.
Hey,
hi
hey
Amit, hi
guys.
Rajan. Hi guys.
Hey, awesome. So today we're going to have a very interesting discussion on this topic of what is happening in legal AI and what are some of the challenges in the legal industry and the AI intersection. Uh, well, I said, let's make it interesting. This can be a very boring topic. The legal industry can be a very boring topic. But then, the legal discussions are never boring. All kinds of legal discussions, whether it is happening in the US or in India. So let's quickly dive in terms of the discussion. But let me actually first start with a quick introduction. Um, uh, Amit, you want to spend 15, 20 seconds just introducing yourself on what Contract Ken does and like what are the things that you're working on, and then after that we'll move to Dilip.
Sure. Hey everyone, my name is Amit. I'm the founder of Contract Ken, and we're essentially an AI co-pilot inside Microsoft Word, which helps lawyers review and draft contracts. That's essentially what we do. Our USP is that we let all of this be done in a very private, safe, and a reliable manner, and we're going to talk about the reliability aspect in detail today.
Dilip, you want to jump in next?
Yeah, hi Dilip. I'm founder of CogniSwitch. Basically, what CogniSwitch does is to create a digital brain that can help enterprises, reliably run their agents, whether it's a co-pilot, autonomous agent, conversational agents. We basically use that AI brain to ensure that these agents work reliably within enterprise use cases. That's what we do.
Yeah, and to introduce myself, my name is Tyagarajan. I go in my short form as Rajan. I'm one of the co-founders of Opeka, an AI accelerator for founders that are building global software businesses. So I will start with Amit. Amit, what happens is that whenever there is a technology shift that happens, what you see is that there are few people who are early adopters. There are few industries that are early adopters. So you take any technology shift, whether it is DVD, whether it is like mobile, or whether it is cloud, you typically see that the finance industry is the first adopter of technology because they have the money, they have the inkling to find out like what this technology can do for them, how can it solve the problem. And in that spread or spectrum, which Jeffrey Moore has talked about in his book of saying early adopter, early majority, late laggard, usually you see legal as a late laggard in that spectrum of adopting technology. But if you look at if the Gen AI or this AI platform shift since the last 3 years, here we've been talking about legal and Gen AI more than any other industry, more than let's say even finance. So what is so interesting about the legal industry and Gen AI, where people are talking about legal and Gen AI as an opportunity space, while all the past experiences has been that legal is a late laggard in terms of adoption of technology.
Yeah, I think some of this bad rap is actually uncalled for. I think lawyers have always adopted technology, although not the always the buzziest things in the market. And they've been working with various machine learning, text processing type of engines, the last 10 or 15 years. And all of us know that law is extremely language specific, text heavy. All the tasks are very very text oriented. So I mean, it's no secret that large language models find a lot of applications in the range of legal tasks. So AI has been around in various shapes and forms in the business of law, right, and a little bit in the practice of law also for the last 10 or 15 years. But when the whole chat GPT thing, and the whole thing blew up a couple of years ago, I think lawyers got very very intrigued, and in all the conferences that I attended, and all the conversations that I was having, everyone was extremely curious, wanted to be educated about what it can do. Does it really deliver what it promises? What sort of use cases are the right ones for lawyers to start experimenting with it. And what has happened is, over the last, I would say, 24 odd months, I think now we are close to 24 months, right, since the GPT 3.5 release, the conversations have sort of shifted from the initial buzz and the hype to, education related discussions in 2023, to, testing out, evaluations, real pilot projects, real proofs of concepts, and then how to move that into production in 2024. So I think as we speak, the industry, and when I say industry, it is both lawyers who are working in law firms as well as lawyers working in enterprise legal teams, uh, are kind of fully, I would say, with the fact that AI is here to stay. It's going to transform a lot of legal tasks, whether it is case law research, summarization, document drafting, patents, e-discovery, everything is these days finding a lot of, AI applications. So I think as you said, Rajan, this is not the industry or the space which sort of adopts this sort of technology first up. But from what I hear, that it's like one of the top three industries or spaces which has picked up the use of Gen AI. And I think it is going to become, um, it is going to accelerate, because everyone that I talk to, you really do not have to sell them on the concept of AI. There is no discussion around, oh, is this really applicable, in our context of contracts. Everyone is really curious to understand, how are you solving a particular problem, what are your capabilities, how are you different from, another provider, and are you the right fit for my use case. So I think the initial hesitation, anxiousness towards a new technology is not there. Now, having said that, of course, we're going to discuss the whole issue of reliability and hallucinations. That's the topic. That I think
Yeah,
is a big hurdle which we still need to,
yeah. So before we go to the
overcome.
challenges, just paint the picture of like what are the opportunities. You're saying that look, it is not a matter of surprise. People have been using this for like last 15, 20 years. Maybe there are opportunities on software and legal that is large enough. But if you were to paint the picture, maybe in terms of like market size or type of opportunities that are there broadly in the intersection of like legal and AI.
Yeah, I mean, it is really really huge. Whichever way you look at the market, right? Whether you look at, sort of the some of the estimates of the the value of the dollar value of the legal services which are delivered annually. Let's say in the US, I think it's close to $750 billion annually, right? Or you look at just the law firms. Most of them report their revenues. If you look at, the total number of lawyers, and I'm specifically talking about the US market. We can of course extrapolate worldwide. The work, there is a humongous amount of work, and then there is a whole aspect about that a large parts of the society do not get access to justice because law is so expensive, right? So that's the other aspect, that AI and this kind of technology can actually make access to justice possible for, a lot of underserved sections, as far as legal
So what you're saying
services,
is
legal
that,
supports.
yeah, there is about $750 billion that is spent by legal professional on legal professional, and that still doesn't serve the legal needs for large swaths of the population. Which means that if that was more affordable, then it may be a spend which is much larger than $750 billion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can have a separate conversation just on this topic. Whether you actually want to increase legal activity, especially litigation, which everyone is not a big fan of, or you want to give more access to people and give them, better understanding of their rights and be able to, claim what is rightfully theirs, right? So it's a huge market, lots of different types of work, and as you're probably aware, that traditionally most of this work, and I think when law students go through their, education, and then they go through their apprenticeship and, their internships, and they go through their career, right? So most of the um, skills that they learn is through reading the documents, through shadowing experienced lawyers, learning by doing, right? And these are huge, hundreds of pages long text. And it's really a skill that you need to develop to be able to read, understand, comprehend, be able to refer that text in a relevant context, right? So I think all of this is something which is actually being welcomed by a lot of people who feel that a lot of this work is better suited for machines than humans, right? And humans should actually be using the output of these sort of algorithms and do things which machines cannot, right? So I think that
Yeah.
that's the way the industry is moving towards.
So I see a market map that is on the screen right now. Is it already that there are so many legal tech, legal AI startups in the world right now? What are the different type of problems they are solving?
Yeah, so I think this is just the early stage. So you can probably multiply this by two or three if you want to look at the total number, right? And I think there are two or three big categories, right? So there is transaction law, right, which is primarily corporate law work, which has to do with contracts, documents, right, disputes, and things like that. There is a big section of work which is related with litigation, trial, the work which happens around, you know, work in courts and things like that. And then just the management of operations, right? Intake of work, management of your practice, billing, things like that. And then there are areas like patents, so on and so forth, right? Which are again a subsection of law, but a huge area in itself. So there are many areas, and I think there isn't any practice area which is untouched by uh, you know by AI right now. And I
So
think
out
all of
of
us know.
the 750 billion, where is it spent most? Which one? Where is the use case of having generative AI most prominent? Is it contract? Is
Uh,
it patent
yeah,
drafting?
so contracts is definitely one of the biggest application areas, as I think most of us can imagine, both in drafting and review and negotiations. That's one of the areas which a lot of companies have been tackling for the last 10 or 15 years, and now with Gen AI, the whole scene seems to have changed, right? Because AI can do like 10x the amount of things which were possible in pre-Gen AI world. Litigation, which requires a lot of legal research, case research, case law summarization, things like that is a big area, big application area. Patents is of course another. E-discovery, right, which is again linked with litigation. So all of these areas where you have large volume of repositories of documents which need to be read through, referred to produce the final output or interim output or check something or query, are finding tools, and there were existing tools. So I think there are
So
some very
amongst
large.
these tools, Amit, which one? I know you've spent like 15 years in the industry. Which ones are with the legal and AI growing the fastest, and which or like either by the revenue? If you were to pick three or four names from that complex market map that we looked at, which one have the highest revenue? Are there obvious names that are out there?
Okay, so I don't think the most recognizable names are on there, right? So of course Harvey, Case Text, which is a part of Thomson Reuters now, are the two biggest sort of players which are taking more of a a mile wide, inch deep type of an approach, right? So they basically are saying we will build the legal AGI, which is saying, okay, we'll do contracts, we'll do drafting, we'll do litigation, we'll do research, we'll do everything through sort of one type
A
of
single interface.
chat interface, right? With of course a RAG pipeline
And what is
built
the
into
size of
that.
their business? What is their revenue, or what is their growth rate in the last 1 or 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, all of this is private, so your guess is as good as mine. You're probably closer to them being based in SF, but I think the way we can sort of extrapolate from the speed at which they've been closing various rounds of funding, right? So going from seed to Series A to Series B, and Case Text actually got bought over by Thomson Reuters for $600 million plus. So there are no public figures available, but they're definitely one of the big um, use cases of Gen AI in the industry, right? And I'm speaking cross domains, not just legal. And then
Let's
within
now
the
shift.
contracts,
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
yeah,
go
within the
ahead.
contract space, I think Spellbook is one player which has really sort of taken the lead. But there are lots of other companies, including ours, which are competing with Spellbook in various parts of the market.
Got it. So, what are some of the challenges? What are now, friction that is coming in the way for some of these? I'm assuming that they're, let's say, $50 million or $100 million in revenue, or inching somewhere there. Let's say that they're inching to $50 million. Now, the TAM of the space is about 750 billion that you said, right? So there is like a lot of opportunity for growth in terms of the narrative that they're painting. What is the friction that is coming in the way? Like, if people are looking for a solution like that, is it because that they're not able to deliver the solution in the way the expectation is there in the market that is coming in the way? What are
Yeah, I
frictions?
think. Yeah, I think. Specifically to legal AI, I think the typical issues to any Gen AI application like privacy, uptime, change in workflow and the people aspects, and I think all of those things are for all domains, not just legal. But I think specifically in legal, reliability is the number one issue, right? And hence the sort of discussion topic, right? Because lawyers are essentially, they have a fiduciary authority to do risk management and produce reliable output. So whatever tools they are using have to have a very very high level of accuracy, right? And those numbers need to be like extremely high, if not 100%. So, some of the events which happened back in 23 and early 24, I think some of the, which got a lot of press, some lawyer used ChatGPT to cook up some, fictitious cases, or somebody used ChatGPT for, creating sort of false narratives in an actual legal case, actually brought a lot of bad rap and focus and attention on that just out of the box using GPT-4 is not going to give you a reliable solution, right? You cannot use that in production. However cool the demo might look like. So, and if you, sort of take a step back and peel the onion a little bit, right? I think the whole, challenge is that, by definition, right, legal opinions are actually not atomic facts, right? On at some level, law is essentially a contested concept, right? So when you are doing an API call to an LLM, or you're doing a RAG pipeline call, deciding what to retrieve can be very challenging in a legal setting, right? So a RAG system must not only be able to locate information from multiple sources across time and place, and if there are no set of available documents that answer the question definitively, then it has to come back with, like, cannot be answered, or it has to refuse the answer, right? And sometimes the
Amit, I'll
the
come
questions.
to you on explaining RAG. I think you straight away jumped into RAG, but I'll also use this opportunity to switch to asking Dilip. Dilip, like we're talking about challenges in Gen AI applications getting adopted in the legal industry, and Amit talked about reliability as a big challenge. Now, within your sphere of experience and what you do at CogniSwitch, you look at multiple use case. Legal is this one vertical that you look at. So, what is your thoughts on what are the challenges with respect to the use case within the legal industry, and do you think these are the same across the other verticals that you look at?
Yeah, Rajan, before I go there, I have one point to add on your question about why legal is now ahead, and it
Oh
has a
yeah, of course.
connection to,
Yeah. Why don't we
yeah.
start with that? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think if you've ever written code, any one of you in the audience, I'm sure lots of them have, then you'll realize that legal has got humongous amounts of text, right? And programming, creating programs around it is not everybody's cup of tea, right? Because there are huge amounts of concept. There are penal codes. There are huge amounts of case laws. then there are also verdicts that come out of it through it, right? So it's not been very easy. Whoever is automated, I mean, people now it is like the chat GPT time, right? Everybody is getting a chance to try these things out. So that's a great thing. So that's why I think you find a lot of interest there, a lot of early stage. That doesn't mean we have already finished the task. It's a path that they are on.
Yeah.
So I think that huge amount. And by the way, LLMs have this great capability of understanding the patterns that humanity uses with respect to natural language. And I think that's a very natural fit. Having said that, reliability is definitely an issue. And like I've been salivating when I saw that early stage, so many of them, forget Harvey, forget whoever else, Thompson, right? I mean, all of them have a chance, right? Because it's now a level playing ground. And I think if any of them who get to fix reliability issues, and give, because that's another side of the coin, with all these humongous amounts of textual content comes the need. And that's why I think human beings have always been in the middle of, in this industry, especially in many industries, but this one. And I think that's why, and I think if the cost is high, then the expertise must be very limited, right? So having said that, why expertise is so important and therefore costly is because it's critical, right? You're going to rule something and going to decide on somebody's fate, or monetarily or life wise or whatever. So I think it is crucial that if you take this, then reliability, as Amit said, is amazingly important as well. So when we look at it, so you know Cognizant story, Rajan, but for the rest of the people who are the audience, we started off and we still are in the business of building digital twins of knowledge, whether it is related to case laws, whether it's related to some disease. I think we believe that if all this has to work in production, as Amit was saying, definitely certain things have to be assured, especially in domains like legal, financial services, insurance, life sciences. Reason? Because the conceptual structures, you LLM is good at playing with humongous amounts of text, but there is definitely lack of conceptual clarity. Think, connections with various entities in a penal code, various concepts in a penal code, how they're connected. If you have a case where somebody's ruled, somebody's made a ruling, a high court, Supreme Court has made a ruling, how and why are they connected to some penal code, right? Based on which, or multiple penal codes, based on which this ruling is come, right? So these connections, these concepts, these connections, an expert lawyer or whoever is in the profession has that right here, right? And it's not just text. So I think this is a big issue in these kind of industries. And what we have seen is, if you can build out, not exactly, but at least some level of that expertise in an AI or machine usable form, then many of these things, these great startups, including what Contract Ken is doing, we can see already the difference that Ken is making compared to some of the others. It's basically because now you start looking at employing those concepts together with the huge capability of the LLMs, then it's a win-win situation. So I think it's critical that this gets into play.
Yeah. So to your earlier point about legal and LLM, the point that you made about that unstructured data, LLMs are really good at dealing with. And so far, before this, all the technology that we had, like the data that gets ingested into a computer or database or data warehouses, all had structural relationship. And toying with that is a very different class of problems when compared to dealing with volumes of data of case laws and others. And that's where I think the LLMs coming in. And that's where you said that the next point of saying that LLMs is something which is just basically predicting the next word, right? That's the fundamental of the technology. In another way, we can say it is compressing a whole lot of unstructured data and then bringing in some implicit patterns between that. But that is very, I would say, pattern matching like, and that is not very concept like. And that lack of that concept is where, like when a question is asked, it may come up with an answer which look like a valid pattern, but they not be the right pattern or the right concept, right? and that's where the hallucination or the reliability issue comes up. So
Yeah, what I
from
was trying to Rajan, what I was trying to say was, it's not like what is the capital of India, and the answer is something Delhi, right? It's not the same when it comes to complicated domains like legal and insurance, and especially regulated and legal kind of stuff. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, which to me is a surprise, right? So if ever, let's say, like a use case is something like writing a blog post, and then you hallucinate a little bit, that is more a feature, right? So you're like expressing yourself creatively. But if you actually come up with this reference to a case law and saying that what had happened in a particular case, and if that turns out to be fictitious, then lives are dependent on that, like judgments and reputation are dependent on that. And
Yeah.
so to me, it's very interesting that the legal industry is adopting this, where the downside of going wrong is very, very high, and how they fix it and how they address it is an important parameter. I mean, if there was like some use case related, let's say sales or marketing, and if it impacts the if it impacts a revenue number, then there will be rollbacks that will happen. But here in legal, it seems to be like the ship is going at full throttle, and
Yeah, I mean,
I'm very excited and curious about that.
yeah, and I think the whole hallucinations thing was brought front and center by Stanford University research, empirical study which came out, I think, about 6 months back, and we have a snapshot of their study, which basically looked at GPT-4, and they are looking at legal research tasks only, right? So nothing to do with contracts or anything. So these are specific questions around case laws, legal research, and things like that. So they looked at three of the industry leading tools which had launched their own AI assisted legal research capabilities, and the Stanford team had access to them as well as GPT-4. So what they did was they created a set of 200 tasks, right, split into 4 or 5 different categories, and basically ran them against these tools and GPT-4. And they had, of course, experts who were evaluating the answers. And as Dilip said, these experts already knew what the right answer was, right? So they were evaluating whether
Include
it's
Harvey. I can only see Lexis, Westlaw, and
yeah,
GPT-4.
practical law. Yeah, yeah. So they didn't include Harvey or some of the other tools. And as you can see, right, the ones in red are basically hallucinations, the one in yellow are incomplete or sometimes refusals, and the ones in green are accurate. So you can see that what their conclusion was, which was actually very hotly debated and refuted by some of these industry players for various reasons, and we can get into that about 15 to 30% of all the output was hallucinating, right? And as you said, Rajan, this is almost unacceptable in legal domain, right? I mean, you can't have half of your or a third of your queries being answered with a hallucination. So a
Fictitious.
lot of back and forth. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about what hallucinations mean in the context of legal in a couple of slides from now. But I think this created a lot of effort around doing some concerted data set creation, measurement of the quality of the responses which are coming out of these tools. And now I think all the serious players are now building out some kind of confidence scores with their GenAI output, right? And we are doing the same at our end, where anything, although we are not generating in contracts, we're not really generating responses like legal research tools do, but even for recommendations that our contract tool is making, we are basically attaching a confidence score based on that. I think one last point I want to make on this is, so GPT-4 is like what you call as a closed book answer, right? The other three tools actually have applied the normal RAG, right, which is the standard RAG technology, which you can call as an open book. And even with
So, Amit,
that
can I
basic RAG,
interrupt you here to say, like, can you just explain what RAG means and why it is relevant here?
yeah, I mean, RAG is as simple as saying that you want the answer to be verified against a reference source, which is a source of truth, right, which is a ground truth. So if I'm asking a question about a very specific subsection or aspect of a case law, the tool needs to have access to that actual case law and not depend upon what the large language model hazy representation exists in its training, right? Because a lot of these large language models, including GPT-4 and Claude, are all trained on case law. That's a well-known fact. But how it was, the data was prepared and how accurately that can be fetched at runtime is a big question mark, which results in hallucinations. So that's why these guys have all built basic RAG pipelines, but in spite of that, you see the results. And that's why, the
Somebody
basic
gave me
RAG
this
does not
analogy.
work in legal.
Yeah. So somebody gave me this analogy that, the general LLM query, the ChatGPT Claude query that you use is like, answering a general knowledge question, a GK question. But then, like, a GK question is not good enough. So you have to actually go and get the person to study 10th standard textbook, or like, in this case, legal case studies, right? Study those
Yeah.
textbook and case studies, and then answer question in that particular domain, so that you are a lot more grounded. So it is like, teaching a person who is good at general knowledge specific knowledge of that particular subject, so that the answers are a lot more specific and closer to what the domain is, as opposed to saying, oh yeah, I know the general knowledge that the Shah Bano case happened in 19x3 and things like that, right? Versus saying, okay, 2023, like this was the Supreme Court specific case that had happened, and that understanding will only come when you study those legal knowledge books, right? So
When you
RAG
have
is this
access to
process
that,
of,
yeah, yes, when you have access to that book, so it's an open book exam, right? You have access to the reference text when you are answering a question, right? So it's akin to an open book exam. But even that is not sufficient for legal, right? I think that's the whole point of what I think Dilip is going to talk about later in the conversation, that you need specialized type of RAG technique. So if you can actually put up the slides, I'll quickly delve a little deeper into what sort of hallucinations do you usually see in the legal aspects. So I think hallucination is something which is factually incorrect or is incorrectly grounded, and factual hallucinations could be like unfaithful to the training data, or unfaithful to what the user is asking for, or unfaithful to the true facts of the world, right? So those are sort of ways to think about it. If we can go to the next slide. There are two ways to think about hallucinations, right? There is a correctness aspect, how factually accurate is the tool's response, and then there is a groundedness, right? How accurate or how is the tool's response related to the cited sources, right? Because all these tools, they come with citations, right? Because they have a basic RAG pipeline built in. But if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about where the right use cases lie. So correctness, of course, you can a response can be correct, or it can be incorrect, or the tool can refuse, right, on the x-axis. But groundedness is like when the tool is providing factual propositions which make valid references, or it could be misgrounded when it has answered the query correctly, but it has actually cited a wrong case or a document or a reference source. And this, I think, is very dangerous, especially in legal, because you might actually get the right response or the correct response based on a wrong source and draw very different conclusions, and go on a very, very wrong path. So having both a correct and a grounded response is paramount, right? I think, Rajan, you were talking about marketing or some of the other spaces where I think correct answer can work in more cases, but you need citations in this space. Yeah.
yeah. So on this RAG part, Dilip, can you actually jump in and explain, like, why and how RAG solves or does not solve or is the source of hallucination? And like, what is the approach that you have seen taken that actually fixes some of the issues with, like, the basic RAG?
Yeah, so
And
I
how do you
think
actually get
for
it to
those
a
of
reliability place where it is really useful for people in the legal industry?
Rajan, your voice is breaking.
Yeah. So can you actually talk about RAG and what are the alternates to actually fix the issues?
Yeah. So first of all, for those of you who might not know, RAG stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation, and I think there's a subtle difference between ChatGPT or GPT-4. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. The GPT-4, which we can assume is ChatGPT, and then the other side you said RAG was used. The reason being, many of them would have, when the training happened, many of them would have seen content related to penal code or maybe some of the existing case laws that has been used probably. But the RAG pipeline is because there are now changes to the penal code or there are some new case laws that have come. So it is external sources from which you need to pull in relevant data and not depending on LLM's patterns that it has seen or data that it's seen. So that's a big difference because you're now depending on only, like you said, closed book. It's like only what you know, right? What the LLM knows. The other is what you're also bringing retrieval from external sources and augmenting it with what the LLM knows. So that's retrieval augmented generation. Now, what we are seeing is even when you say all these things, if you see how RAG typically works, there are huge amounts of textual natural language information which is now cut up or chunked up into pieces, and then those are actually kept indexed and stored somewhere. And when a request comes in, when somebody asks a question, right? So if it is directly a question related to provisions of a penal code, maybe an LLM can directly answer it. The closed book will work. Now, if you are asking a question related to a case that happened recently, then some external source from which you need to understand what happened in the case. So let's say the case information is now chunked up, and you bringing those chunks of text, which the LLM has not seen for sure before. It has some definite information which it has seen about the penal code and probably some other case laws. Now, like you rightly, an LLM, a large language model, is a probabilistic engine based on the
Parrot.
patterns. It's a
A parrot.
it's a that's slightly derogatory word, but I think yeah, it uses some kind of probability with a kind of metrics that it has to keep predicting, like in your old AI also keep predicting things. It could work, but there are some issue challenges there. Now, when you get this text, it is not the full context. Somebody is retrieving outside of the LLM, somebody is retrieving certain pieces of text which they think is relevant for this particular question. And we can get into the details of how it is done, but to keep it simple. And then you're giving it to the LLM, who, let's assume in full faith, takes that and uses some patterns that it has internally and try to generate. That's why they are called generated responses. It generates actually predicts the next set of words, which is answer and it also many times works well. But because of these gaps we talked about, which is conceptually the LLM has those concepts being available and the relationship between the structures and the inability for the LLM to know whether the most relevant pieces of text has been pulled out by this external system that brings the text to it. It all adds to the problems that we are now collectively facing. So
Right.
if
But
you take
why
that,
does that hallucination happen, right? What's the source of the hallucination? Is it because of the specific way the systems are designed?
so when you like you said, imagine you give a textbook on physics first to someone who doesn't know physics at all, which is not, I'm just making this up, right? Conceptually, you don't understand gravity. And now, if you have to explain what happened when, Albert Einstein saw the apple fall down, it's going to be very difficult, even if it has seen some text about certain things that Albert Einstein saw, maybe one page write up about him. It's not going to be very easy to define, to actually explain that, right? You can get, when you have questions, and in legal domain, I'm sure it is not a simple question. It connects up multiple things, right? Things related to that case, things related to a penal code, multiple contextual stuff. And that is where the hallucination happening. Because pattern wise, it could execution could be a contract execution or execution, God forbid, of a human being, right? This both figure in your legal domain. Now you can get confused, right?
But Dilip, isn't that actually handled by embedding models where like especially in like how the language models are designed, saying that when you look at the attention part of it, I mean I'm going into the specific or like the technicalities of how this is done. They say that these two words like the execution in contract and execution in killing someone is two different meaning, but like that is provided in the context. So at least the new models of transformer and others are supposed to actually learn this and give the right meaning of execution differently. But still, the hallucination comes, right, which is
Yeah,
beyond that context is understood, right? And is
yeah.
that because of what?
So let's take first tackle the external. Let's keep LLM aside because already maligned quite a bit, right? If you take the other side, which is RAG the way we are doing it today, these chunks, when I told pieces of text, are basically 200, 300 words, which is like maybe 600 tokens, right? And those are actually sent, those pieces of text are sent to a, an endpoint which does converts those words, those 200, 600 words with respect to, it's also related. That's why people say you should also know what are you using to create those embeddings. But eventually, when you give these 200 words or 300 words, what you get in return is a vector, which is like numbers, static numbers. And these are what is kept inside a index, right? And when you have a question, maybe it is 20 words, right? And then that is also embedded, and a vector comes up, right? And you are now taking that 20 word vector and hitting it against the 300 index made out of 300 word vectors. If the corpus is big enough, you can potentially get many hits. Of course, the RAG community has really gone and done some fantastic work to now re-rank it and to do various forms of RAG to ensure that, because the first problem was that the top 10 was not relevant for this particular question, right? It might have met the cosine, some kind of similarity mechanisms that they use. They use multiple, and they're too technical. If you don't, I don't think we should get into this. But they use similarity mechanisms to find out which are those chunks of text I should pull out. Now, those don't ensure that the most relevant for this particular question is coming out. Maybe that's in the last 20, right? So people realize
So,
that.
Dilip, how are you then fixing it? Okay, I think we're getting too technical. So the moment we said embedding, the moment we said vector, I think we've lost
Yes,
90% of the audience. We are taking some words, we are like we're translating that words into some other representation, which is like numbers. And
correct.
we are saying two numbers are to be matched and seen how similar are they. And like execution in one context will be similar to contract, another context will be similar to killing, right? So that's the thing that is happening in the back end. But this what you're saying is the source of hallucination. What are you doing to help fix that? Like how is Cogniswitch, or like or what are other approaches other than Cogniswitch that people have taken in the industry to solve this hallucination issue that people building legal AI apps can actually adopt?
Yeah. So before we get into what Cogniswitch is doing, you in the last 2 3 months, maybe or more, you must have heard about something called graph rag,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, there is a meme on Twitter. There are like 16 types of rag. The basic rag, there is graph rag, there is extension rag, and follow on.
Yeah.
So tell me more
So
about graph rag.
some people also, there's one variation people call knowledge graph, because graphs could be different from a knowledge graph. But anyway, it became very popular because Microsoft actually really released a paper on GraphRag. Basically, that what that says is, I mean, the idea is, can we take the content, and instead of just, we need to use embeddings, need to use vectors, but can we first take this content and actually take knowledge and insights in that content and transform it into a different information structure, you know first and foremost, and can we automate that process? And magic, and people figured out that the LLM can actually help in that task, taking large corpuses of text and then helping which is like very unstructured. Even if it's structured, it's natural language data and unidimensional. Use certain NLP and other mechanisms, including LLMs. We use LLMs a lot to actually extract, mine relevant information so that we can create a more connected, richer, deeper information structure on which now we can start providing conceptual connections when a question comes in. For example, if the question is about something to do with a certain type of, you know, crime, and therefore you can find out if this is a crime, what provisions of which penal codes apply, what provisions could potentially go in. You could also have this particular graph is nothing but, like you can say entities and relationships, and people who have even programmed using, object oriented relation structures will know entities and relationships, and also properties of those entities and those relations. So mining that information, like for example, if it is related to some violation, that violation is an entity, and then there could be some properties related to that, and that there it could be related to it. It is comes under the provision of a certain penal code. That penal code could be another entity, and there could be a relation between those two. So
So
information structure.
would it be right to say, if I were to paraphrase you, the GPT, or when we're just using OpenAI, like, directly, then it is taking a general knowledge quiz about maybe a legal question. When you apply simple RAG, it is about making sure that GPT system is given the context, or it is made to actually study the legal text. But then it is probably just mugging up. So if it is asked a question, it just picks up without the conceptual understanding of that, and then just goes and looks up on the index and then says, oh, somewhere I've heard the word like this, so let me actually give you an answer which is much closer in the legal textbook as opposed to the general knowledge textbook that it has been trained on. And then with respect to graph based RAG, the AI system is made to understand what is there in the legal textbook a lot more conceptually, and form conceptual graphs in its memory, or I mean in its internal system, and answer that question. So therefore the answers are a lot more conceptual. So if you throw a conceptual curveball, the guy who has mugged up and prepared for my exam cannot answer. So
Yeah.
would that be
So
like a
it's
good
like
reference between
it's
RAG
a,
versus graph RAG?
it's a very good example, and especially even if it's closed book, if that learner had actually understood the concepts first, then if you come up with a problem where that concepts could be applied together with some other external information, it could potentially be able to handle it well. You're right, the person who mugs it will struggle, and when a problem comes which he or she has not seen before, and the other person who could apply the concepts could do well. And by the way, if you could combine these two, some magic could also happen. And that is what Cogniswitch is trying to do. Imagine one side of your brain is that mugger, and the other is the fellow with the concept, right? Imagine putting those two together, and some basic rules which your teacher told you. Even if this says something, that says something, you also have some rules you have to apply from your mind. Imagine like a three-piece system that works. That could be Cogniswitch.
Awesome. So we should jump and take some questions. So for those who are listening in, please put down your question on the comments box, and I'll pick them one by one. There's one question from Manoj, and both Amit or Dilip can pick this up. His question is, does this help in understanding criticality or relevance of subject, so that it does not take outlier event as an important event? And I'm assuming Manoj is referring to more from the context of graph RAG. Who wants to take it, Dilip or Amit?
Yeah, I
I
mean, I
had
can
I mean,
quickly.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of structured data, I think outlier detection and treatment is a very regular uh, technique that is used for building and using machine learning models. But in GenAI, I think how the outliers are treated by GenAI model is something which only the people who have trained and prepared the data for GenAI models know. So, for example, if there is some very unique, you know, peculiar law in a particular state of US which does not exist in any other state, is that going to impact the response to a query which is somehow related to that peculiarity? Yeah, maybe yes. So, I mean, I think the short answer is to kind of manage those type of things. You definitely need to build guardrails, right? And I think Cogniswitch, is kind of one step in that direction where you can use uh, guardrails and RAG more intelligently. But I think a lot of these questions are, dependent on who has trained the model and how they have prepared the data.
Yeah, this is like,
Can I
coming up with a question which is out of syllabus, right? So, so
can I can I can I add to
yeah,
that?
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
Dilip.
So the other thing we need to also, we, an outlier event is you classify it as an outlier because you probably have not even seen some of the patterns that could potentially make it a non-outlier. Because as a human being, our analysis would have said this is outlier. But maybe there are some of these AI models are coming and telling us this is not outlier. It can tell you, it sees those patterns because it processes humongous amounts of data and could come and say this is not an outlier. And this very much is something that could happen, but you're not seeing it, and therefore you're attributing some other reason, so you're trying to find out those connections. So
Yeah, I mean, that's a good, interesting way to look at. Let's go to the next one, which is from Jitain. What he is asking is if Gen AI gets better at reasoning, can it help reduce hallucination and improve reliability? And can reasoning be an approach? Uh, can reasoning can be made better by building knowledge graphs? Dilip, you want to go on this
so
one?
yeah, sure. Yeah, so quickly, Gen AI is a system, and it's not just LLM, right? So if you think generative AI, LLM is a very key component, but I think thinking that everything will be done by LLM is a folly, right? So therefore, you have multiple things. RAG itself is one part of the Gen AI system, right? And various types of RAGs have now come in, as you know. So reasoning is something. Even reasoning capabilities. They're saying, like for example, you create agents who actually divide your main task into multiple tasks. A multi-hop question, like a complex question, gets split into small, simpler questions, and then people find answers. These agents find answers to each of those simple questions, and then you take it and then make an LLM probably answer the question. So those kind of things have been tried. So definitely everybody is working hard to reduce hallucination, but you also look at how a knowledge graph is. Everything is deterministic. So this is in a way it's symbolic, right? Like rules and logic. These connections are deterministic, and therefore those are very symbolic mechanisms of doing it. So you are actually combining the great neural capability of an LLM and the great deterministic symbolic capabilities of a knowledge graph kind of structure. That's what I meant by the left and the right brain. We bring it together. That is where definitely, if you bring it together, and most of the time, this knowledge itself keeps updating, right? Knowledge, if it had stood still, we wouldn't have we would have come to where we are today. So therefore, an external symbolic kind of knowledge graph kind of system that keeps getting dynamically updated, and a neuro capability, and when very neatly coupled together, can definitely create very reliable systems. It can be,
So,
we can do it today.
Dilip, the next one, and again, I'll ask you to jump in. This is from Sandeep. He's asking, will access to private models like Llama address the hallucination challenge to a certain extent? I thought, like, Llama was more publicly available. But anyway, I think the spirit of the question is that, can Llama address hallucination challenges to a certain extent?
uh, I mean, I wouldn't,
Can I
hallucination
can I jump
wise,
in?
you
Yeah,
can,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
Amit, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think model A or model B can actually solve hallucination, because it is actually not a bug, right? It's a feature of how
A
large
language
language
model
models
is.
work. Yeah, so it's wrong to think of them as a bug to be solved, but a situation to be managed in the context of your business use case. And I think in the case of if legal AI, I think what people are doing to solve these hallucination issues, which are much more acute in legal research space, but companies like ours, which are building in contract space, are learning from those companies how they are solving hallucination, and we're trying to apply similar techniques. I think you need knowledge base, right? So you need either your company knowledge base or some industry knowledge base. You need some sort of playbooks, and then you need a human in the loop, right? So, and that I think brings back to the topic that we started with, Rajan, that how's the adoption going. So I think that is one of the reasons why the initial excitement and the pilots have now resulted in everyone spending a lot more time and effort. And it is actually difficult to evaluate these things. You need a lot of expertise, you need a structured data, a set of tasks to come up with a quantitative measure whether a particular system or a tool is performing well on hallucination. So I think that's where the industry is moving in the context of legal. But if there's anything specific, Philip, you want to add?
Yeah, maybe we should move to the next two questions. So the next one, Dilip, I think you should chime in. How to continuously update the knowledge base of a RAG system? Any examples you can share?
So yeah, it depends on what kind of RAG system you're using. There are different, like Rajan said, there are different ways of uh, different variations of RAG systems that are there. But I think typically many of these updates currently the way is not a very simple trivial task. It definitely is a costly and a heavy task to be done. So it's not easy to just go and update. And also there are things like temporal. For example, when you say time, so there are certain things that get actually time barred, for example, and therefore there are issues related to that. Things an offer might get might be only for 14 days, right? So it's a very, I mean, it's a topic in itself to get into how it is possible, uh, whether it's any type of rag, graph rag, fusion drag, or other rag. It is possible, but it's an involved task. It's not something like you take just a Llama Index sample notebook and just use some default and then start writing code. For proof of concepts, great, but production, no.
Yeah, there's one more question. Let's take that up before we move towards wrapping up. I hope the data and privacy related, I hope data privacy security related challenges are addressed well along with hallucination and RAG. Either of you go for it.
Amit, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a separate topic. I think RAG and whichever flavor of RAG you are deploying is more to make it reliable, contextual. Whereas privacy, data security, I think is I think there are elements of it that you can do within a RAG system, within a GenAI system, right? As Philip mentioned, GenAI is not a model, but it's a system. But I think it's slightly differently managed depending on what's your sort of privacy stack.
In
Awesome.
fact,
So we are
if the security and privacy is an issue, some of these open source some of these open source have become equally as good as some of the closed ones. And I think that opens up potential opportunities to have this right within your firewall, within your own private cloud. So I think some of those challenges are also getting addressed today.
So, Dilip, Amit, we are right up on our time. I want to ask each one of you any closing comments on our topic today on, like, the opportunity in the legal space, the challenges in the legal space, the approach to solve some of the immediate friction that we have so that it can unlock this from what it is today to, like, the total potential that is possible.
Yeah, I
Any
mean,
last comments?
from a legal and contracts standpoint, it's a big opportunity, but I think you need to handle the privacy and the reliability issues with a real purpose, right? Not just for not just for narrative purposes. And if you do that, I think lawyers and companies are willing to adopt. So it's a big opportunity. We will see this continue to grow.
So you're saying that
Yeah,
if that particular technical problem is solved, then real business and large business can rebound.
That's correct.
yeah. So yeah.
Dilip.
So yeah, for me, I think it is important to, it's good that these things happen. It's good, in my opinion, it's good that ChatGPT happened. People experience the power of something, and that leads to widespread use. Rajan, how we were struggling to, we were hollering about knowledge graph and graph related mechanisms for like last 2 years. And well, now of course people are, when people used it, they start, when you use something more, you appreciate good things about it, but you also start seeing some of the challenges. And once you see that, everybody will work towards solving those problems. And I think this cycle is required, which also tells me this is not going away, it is going to be there. And for sure people are putting in efforts, and these are opportunities I see for startups both in the legal and the tech domain, to work together to ensure that these things are ironed out. Because as more and more, and we work closely with early adopters and design partners, these are some things that would come out, and any nimble, fast, highly focused set of startups could actually tackle some of these problems. And I'm very sure the future is going to be where these things are. I saw what you wrote today, Rajan. AGI is, I think you said AGI is already here. And I think that is the truth. I mean, depends on how, who's defining AGI, right? So I think this is not like some fancy fad that's coming and going. This is going to be here, and I think it's a great opportunity for both users to utilize some of these technologies, and for multiple startups to actually benefit and create great businesses out of it.
So for me, the takeaway that I want to leave the audience with is to say that amongst the many industry verticals that are there, lawyers and the legal use cases are very, very real, very, very near, very, very grounded, right? Compared to many other use cases that are there. So there is an opportunity for building business there. But then reliability and privacy and hallucination, the associated issues that are there with that, that needs to be solved. And if you use graph RAG or knowledge graph based RAG, then you can like solve that to a lot more extent than how it is getting solved today, and that will lead to the adoption and then building that business. So that's the takeaway that I want to leave the audience with. Amit, Dilip, thank you so much for spending this hour and like shining some light on the opportunities and challenges of legal and AI. We'll
Thanks.
meet
Thank
in
you.
another
It's a pleasure.
a similar session, and till then, bye, folks.
Thank you. It's a pleasure
Thanks,
meeting
Rajan.
all of you.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah,
Thank you.
bye bye.